Good morning, afternoon, or evening, and welcome to the Tom Zero AD YouTube channel. Today we have something pretty special. Much like London buses, you wait a couple of years for a new alpha of Zero AD, and then another one shows up shortly after. So later in 2021, we will have Alpha 25. So why don't we have a look at what's included? Now, as you may or may not be aware, you can actually contribute to Zero AD as an open source game in lots of different ways. And it's not just through coding, artwork, or translating into new languages. There are actually plenty of ways that require no specialist knowledge whatsoever. Some of the most obvious are new ideas for units, civilizations, or technologies, but one of the most important is playtesting to see how these units and techs affect the balancing. Now, I've been looking through some of the discussions around the balancing, and it's currently led by the top players in the world. Now, I fully accept that their opinions as the best players are the most important, but I also think there should be representation from, shall we say, average or mediocre players as well. Because of this, I encourage players across all ranges to volunteer to get involved in playtesting to ensure that your voice is represented. After all, your views are probably more representative of the many hundreds of players there are than just the best players. And in that spirit, we ourselves will be doing just that on the next Tom Zero AD livestream, when Alistair Findlay and I will see how much impact the balancing changes have made for us as lesser players. This is going to be on 7th of May, and we'll also have one of the main devs in Stan on the show, and we'll be able to make our feedback directly to him, and you can also ask him any questions that you have as well. So if you like, subscribe, click the bell, all those sort of things, then information and notifications about that stream will be coming your way. Anyway, that leads us rather nicely on to what are the big changes in Alpha 25? Well, why don't we get into it? So, the following are not all the changes, as there are actually nice little improvements to the game engine, such as units pushing each other out of the way rather than getting stuck, and also a more efficient approach to researching text, but we're focusing on gameplay here, so what are the big ones? So, the first one we're looking at is that towers are no longer one of the Phase 2 structures required for progression to Phase 3. But to compensate for that, the number of buildings required has been reduced from 4 to 3. So it's quite an interesting move that basically removes the option to build towers in Phase 1 and then upgrade them in Phase 2. It may discourage use of towers on that basis, but it also makes it very easy to just build one each of the main Phase 2 buildings, the forge, the temple, and the market, in order to progress. So it's a change that may have interesting consequences, but I can't really see anything that jumps out. The second move is a big amendment to Archery tradition, and for me this one is huge. As of Alpha 24, archers went from being the worst infantry range unit to the best overnight. Archery tradition made this difference even more stark as it reduced training time for archers by 10%, as well as increasing their range by 10 meters, and it was available at Phase 1. So this update will remove the reduction in training time, but as a consequence it will also see the cost and research time reduced to compensate. So instead of 500 wood and 300 metal, it's now 400 food and 200 metal, and its research time drops by a third from 60 to 40 seconds. This is another one where I'm not really clear what the impact is going to be. On the one hand, the fact that archers won't be able to be spammed out as quickly as they previously were certainly will help to reduce how OP the archer factions were, but it will also make this tech far less desirable. I think that in the main, what will probably happen is that fewer people get the tech, but for those that do, it will prove useful, although they'll probably get it later in the game. At number 3, we have removal of the embassy limit. Now, the big beneficiaries for this are going to be the Carthaginians, for whom I think this move is long overdue. For me, it's been somewhat unfair that in Alpha 23, Carthaginians could only train their mercenaries, who, it's important to remember, comprise some of their best soldiers, from 2 buildings, while their opponent could build as many barracks as they wanted from which to train soldiers. Now, even Alpha 24 only increased this from 2 to 3, so this move will certainly help cement the Carthaginians' place nearer to the top of the faction tree. The other beneficiaries are the Kushites, but for me, as they're already a very good faction, and as well, remember that their embassies can be built in neutral territory, I'm not sure that they needed this boost. Allowing them to train more of their killer mercenary clubmen in their enemy's sphere of influence to smash down key buildings is a huge bonus and something that may need to be balanced out if they're not to become too OP for the game. Our fourth change is a buff to range cavalry. So if you played Alpha 22 and Alpha 23, you would have been on the receiving end and probably giving out plenty of cavalry rushes. They were fairly standard. But Alpha 24 increased the training time, the turning circle, and reduced the speed of cavalry, and they made this a far less useful prospect. So, in order to help bring cavalry rushes back and make the game a bit more end-to-end right from the start, the citizen soldier cavalry training time has been reduced from 16 to 15 seconds, and for champions it's been reduced from 27 to 25 seconds. There is another buff, and that applies only to range cavalry, and that's that their speed has increased from 15 to 16, and that reduces the gap to melee cavalry that have an 18 walk speed. The intention is that this makes cavalry rushes a more viable prospect as they're easier to initiate and more difficult to defend. Whether you think it's a good thing or not probably depends on whether you were the one attacking or defending them in the older alphas. And the final thing we're looking at is the removing of attack from wall turrets. So you may or may not be aware that turrets at the corner of walls can be garrisoned and they'll fire arrows. Now, they're not as deadly as towers, but they don't have restrictions on how many can be placed or how closely they can be placed together. This means they're effectively a cheat in order to get virtually invulnerable arrows firing at your enemy. However, Alpha 25 will make this a thing of the past. Turrets will no longer fire arrows at all, and that makes this cheeky little attempt to circumnavigate the game's intentions redundant. So for me, excellent move, and one that, as few people actually knew about this tactic, is going to have little effect on their game. And those are the biggest changes coming in Alpha 25. The deadline to submit any changes that you would like to see, including having them coded, is the beginning of June. So if you want to comment on any of the changes or propose any of them yourself, then do it as soon as possible. Otherwise, just like to say, like, subscribe, all those sorts of things, and I'll see you on the live stream on 7th of May, where we'll be playing Alpha 25, and we'll also, as I said, have Stan on the stream to answer any questions that you have about it. So whack them on Twitter, whack them in the comments, send me an email, whatever, and we'll see you there. Obrigado e adeus.